Welcome to the College Football Survivor Show, where playoff survival is always on the line. Here's Shehan Jeyarajah and Bobak Hayeri.
Hey everybody, it's the College Football Survivor Show. I'm Bobak Hayeri with my co-host Shehan Jeyarajah, national college football writer for CBS Sports. We're glad to have you joining us. Now, today we're going to be talking about kind of not getting too basic on this, but there was a really interesting webinar put together for the media by the College Football Playoff. Shehan and I were both listening into it. We learned some interesting insights. Of course, Shehan's had an opportunity. He's also in the same city as the College Football Playoff to get to know some of the folks that are actually running this whole big shebang. So we're going to talk a little bit about what we learned from that and how this playoff is going to be structured, especially in picking the way teams will be not only seeded, but where they will go. And then we'll, of course, talk about some of the big matchups coming up in Week 10. But before we begin, let me remind you, you can find us on X and TikTok at CFP Survivor Show, where we have video highlights of the show, run polls, and listen to your feedback. Take a moment to like, rate, and subscribe. Tell your friends. We always love that. But without further ado, how are you doing, Shehan?
I'm good. Yeah, it's been a long week. Actually, that's not true. It's been a long year. We're just getting down to crunch time. It's nice to, I guess by the time that some of you are listening to this, it's going to be November, which is just crazy. The season has flown by in so many ways. And also, yeah, happy Halloween if you're listening to it on Halloween itself when the episode will come out.
Absolutely, yeah. Just total side note. I before this show began, I was telling our producer, like, my kid carved a pumpkin on his own. First time he got the pumpkin at a pumpkin patch. He went out, carved it, no parental help whatsoever, put it out front. This morning I saw it was looking fine. This afternoon I got a delivery and the guy was like, "What happened to the pumpkin?" And my Zoom showed just the outline of gray fur. A squirrel decided to have a go at its face. So it actually still looks kind of scary. But yeah, so if you're listening to this on Halloween, look out for those squirrels, man. That's all I got to say. So completely related to the college football playoff. But anyway, all that said, so it was an interesting webinar. They had put it on just, I think, it's a standard thing, just kind of a Zoom presentation, an opportunity to hear. And it makes sense. This is something that I think should be done to educate the press on and remind us what the 12-team format is going to look like, using kind of a quick example, running through, running the whole thing through, just so that we can also educate the public. They did an interesting kind of format. They used the final CFP ranking from 2023, so before the actual games were played, and then they ran that through the 12-team format, while also making sure all the teams were actually placed in the 2024 conferences. So, for example, Washington, despite being number 2, the Pac-12 is, this isn't the Pac-12. They're still in the Big Ten with Michigan. So Michigan would have been the first seed. Texas would have not been the Big 12. They would have been the top SEC seed. And then it was interesting because then Florida State became the ACC seed as number 5. So they were the 3rd seed. And then Arizona, way down at 14, but they were, at least in the current Big 12 lineup, the highest ranked team. And then Liberty was, down at 23. So it worked out kind of like we would have expected. It was fascinating to see all of that. But all of that said, what did you make of this? I mean, did you learn anything new yourself, Shehan, listening to kind of this presentation?
Yeah, I mean, it was good to get kind of a refresher on how all of this would work. And, for me, I went through the mock selection earlier this year. So a lot of the things that we heard were kind of the same. But, I think that the new executive director, Rich Clark, did a really good job of running through it. The thing that I want to emphasize people the most, and we've kind of been banging this drum for a few months now, you got to get used to the difference between ranking and seeding. Those are two different things. They're going to end up being two different things. I think that something that Rich said that was really good is, don't think of it from the perspective like this team was bumped out of the top 12 because of the auto bids. They were not in our field in the first place because that's just not how the system works. So you mentioned it. Arizona comes in from the Big 12 to be the 4th seed. They were the number 14 team in the rankings, but they were the 4 seed. Again, that's how the system is going to work. it's going to throw a lot of people off the first time that we go through this and do this. So, I'm sure that's the maddest probably that people will get next Tuesday is when people hear about ranking versus seeding. There's definitely nothing else going on next Tuesday that people are going to get mad about. But like, I think that people have to get used to that idea. I'm really curious too, and he didn't really touch on it, and it's not really his purview, but I'm really curious how ESPN ultimately decides to actually unveil the rankings in the bracket. I imagine what they'll do is they'll go and release the top 25 like before. But what I'm also curious about is, they've usually gone and been like, okay, here's 25 through 7, and then we go to break and we come back from the break and then we reveal the top 6 and do it dramatically. But like, this is going to be pretty different whenever you do it in 2024 in a 12-team field, because the rankings are very separate from the seedings. And so I am curious, do they just release the 25-1 rankings, especially the first time around, and then come back from the break and show how they would be seated on the bracket? I don't really know the answer to that question at this point. The other thing too is that any bracketing that's done on the broadcast before the end of the season like has an asterisk, because conference championships are something that will directly impact who actually ends up in the top 4. So I'm fascinated to see is the short answer of it. But no, I mean, it was mostly a refresher for me, but it was a really good one to go through.
I do wonder, because the real drama is going to arguably be, it's not going to be the conference champs, because we know who the conference champs are going to be, and those are going to be pretty locked in. The drama is going to be, 10, 11, 12, especially if the G5 is like, let's say, again, we do acknowledge Boise State, if they end up being the G5, will likely be probably above 12 by the end of the season. They might be, I'm not saying they're going to be
so.
Yeah. So who are going to be those last 3 spots that aren't assuming it isn't the G5 spot on the bottom? Or if we get a situation like last season where there was controversy on who's going to get the G5 spot, was it going to be SMU with a couple of losses, or was it going to be Liberty? Who knows? But if you're trying to maximize TV drama, I think that's going to be it. And especially this season, some of the teams that are going to be looking for that spot could be Alabama. That'll be drama. Even though Florida State has safely played its way out of any consideration, there'll be a lot of Schadenfreude if that situation.
And I will say too, is that there's going to be a team, like for example, I think last year would have been Oklahoma. There's going to be a team that sees the final rankings come out and it's like, yes, we're 12, we're in, because they forget how the system works. Like they just don't know how the system works. And then they're going to not end up in the top 12 seeds because, again, they never would have ended up in the top 12 seeds based on the system. And they're going to be like, but I thought we just had a 12 by our name. Doesn't mean that and no, it's different. It's a different system. It's a different thing. There's a reason, for example, that the college basketball tournament releases their bracket first and then releases their seeds after that, so that there isn't this confusion. We're not going to be doing that, especially since we have a made-for-TV product of releasing 5 or 6 different rankings. And some people are going to lose their mind.
It's funny you mentioned that, because when they were running this kind of example mock selection, the first team out was number 11 Ole Miss, because with the way it was set up, again, remember, they were using the final 2023 CFP ranking and using the current conference champs. 2 of those conference champs were not in the top 12. Arizona was 14, so they took a spot, and then Liberty came up and took another spot. So 2 teams in the top 12 were excluded, Mississippi and then Oklahoma. Now, normally Oklahoma would have been the one that would have just been normally shocked and upset, but this time it was Mississippi as well got bumped out because they had to reach down and grab the top 5 conference champs. Another aspect of this that was interesting to me was, and I remember hearing this in bits and pieces, especially over the offseason, but to actually see it put into action was fascinating. The quarterfinals, which of course rotate through most of the New Year's Six. Now, the Rose Bowl has agreed to just be a permanent quarterfinal because they want to keep that date. And that's a tradition. They're the granddaddy of them all. They really are. They're by far the oldest bowl. They just want tradition. Fine. So the other 5 are going to rotate through. And the way those seeds that get in there, because of course the top 4 get to bypass the first round games and just immediately go to the quarterfinals. The way those teams are placed is fascinating because it's going to not have to do with anything other than the first level is conference affiliation, if any of those bowls have one with the current teams. And then second was fascinating. It was proximity. So when they ran through the last season's the last season's final CFP ranking, you had Michigan number 1. They would therefore in this current year go to the Rose Bowl because there's obviously the Big Ten connection there. Texas has a Sugar Bowl tie-in because of the SEC, which again, that one took me a second. I'm like, oh yeah, they're SEC now. They're SEC. But then the other 2 bowls, which would have been dealing with either the conference champions of Florida State and Arizona, they would then go to proximity. So Florida State would go to the Peach Bowl, and Arizona would be basically almost not a home game. They're not in Phoenix, but they'd be in the Fiesta Bowl. And that was absolutely fascinating to hear that, particularly when we see how some of these are going to balance out. And another thing to it too, it's like you could end up with a team going in that's actually located closer than those first 4 seeds. It's fascinating stuff.
I'll tell you. So I did actually our first like bracketing exercise back when I was reporting in like April or something, like when they had just come out with the system. Essentially, they brought us in to let us try it. And the funny thing was, and it was very early on, they were still working through the details. It was still Bill Hancock at the time because Rich Clark had not even started as yet. But I was kind of like, look, so is what you're telling me that if Cal is playing Florida in a bowl game, they have to play in Miami? And the answer is yes. Like, the answer is yes. They don't get a choice in the matter. And so this is only going to be, like you mentioned, for the next 2 years as the existing bowl contracts ride out in 2024 and 2025. For people who don't know, the college football playoffs initial contract ends after the 2025 season, and nothing exists after that. The only thing that's been agreed to at this point is that there will be a college football playoff, and it will be at least 12 teams. Nothing, it could be 14, it could be like none of that's been decided as yet. Nothing with auto bids or any of this thing. There will be a playoff of at least 12 teams. And also the other thing is that it will be owned by ESPN. That was the other piece that's been decided. Everything else at this point is still up in the air. And we'll kind of have to see how bowls factor in long term, but it's gonna be a little weird at the beginning. It's gonna be a little weird, and it's just, again, something that people are gonna have to get used to.
Yeah, it's another aspect of this that's also interesting because, again, as I mentioned, these bowls do rotate through who's going to be in and who's going to be out. And I will assume somehow the Rose Bowl will manage to negotiate. No, you still have to send me the Big Ten champ. I would be shocked if they don't manage that because they have an ability to negotiate anything. But with this season, the Cotton Bowl and the Orange Bowl are semifinals. Now,
yes,
bowls acting as semifinals do not get their conference affiliation. There's no tie-in there. They're literally just going to get the winners of the quarterfinals. And what was fascinating is that they're going to be seeded by they're going to be placed by proximity. I assume favoring seeding. I assume not the number 1 seed, because the number 1 could lose, but whoever the highest ranked seed, I believe, out of the quarterfinals is going to get placed based on proximity. And I have to say that one because there could be almost a tie. And I think that'll end up acting like because in the 4-team playoff, for those who don't remember, because I've had people say like, oh, it'll be like when Washington had to play Texas in the Sugar Bowl. I'm like, slow down. Neither team had any choice in that. When the 4-team playoff, the first seed got to pick what semifinal they got to go to. And Michigan absolutely wanted to go to the Rose Bowl, partly because of the tradition, partly to force Alabama to have to cross the country to play them. And then that therefore automatically stuck, no matter who 2 and 3 were, into the Sugar Bowl. So this time that's going to be kicked off by the proximity, I believe, of the top seed, which could end up with some kind of quirky situations because we have the Cotton and you have the Orange Bowl. If, let's say, Oregon is the number 1 seed and they win and they go on to the semifinal, the closest is to them is going to be the game in Texas. And what if Texas is the other team? That could be a really fascinating situation. They might want to be like, well, we'd rather go to Florida, but they clarified this. I remember there was kind of a question, Rich Clark, and it was clarified by the communication director, Brent Danielson, that nope, it is going to be based on proximity only.
Yeah, it's going to be a little weird. Again, this is a short-term thing. We don't even know if the Bulls will be involved at all starting in 2026, but it's something they're going to have to work through. Another question that I've gotten is, how are rematches going to be taken under consideration? And the answer is that they won't. Mm-hmm. And just for a second, I want to go through how the actual process works of ranking the teams. So the rankings are actually done in small groups. So like at the beginning, it's 1 through 3, 3 through 6, 6 through 9. Then it moves into groups of 4, 10 through 13, etc., all the way through 25. And so this ranking is done and created at first, and there's no consideration paid to the bracket at all. Like, you are just putting together a ranking. So at the end, when the rankings are converted into a bracket, there is the possibility, of course, of being rematches. And what the committee has said and what the college football playoff has said is, look, our field is too small to try and avoid rematches. It's one thing to try to do it in college basketball, where you're maybe putting the 35th seed and the 44th seed and trying to get them in better position. But it's a different thing when there are only 12, and even changing one line might completely change a path in the college football playoff. So like, let's just, for example, say in the, let's say it's Oregon is the 5 seed, Boise State's the 12 seed. That would be a direct rematch. It would also happen at the same location as the first one of these games, when Oregon played Boise State at Oregon before. But here's the issue. If you move Oregon to 6, then the path, instead of 5-12 and 4-5 and 1-5, becomes 6-11, 3-6, and then you play the 2 seed. So like, it's a completely different path at that point. It's not just the individual game that would be impacted, it's the entire pathway to winning a national championship changes. You wait longer to have to play the 1 seed, for example. So it's just very, very different. If you even change one line of it. So no, the answer is that rematches will not be taken under consideration. There's a very realistic possibility that, I've heard it said, like, we could have a scenario where we have potentially a 3-time rematch, where there's a regular season matchup, a conference championship game matchup, and maybe in like the second round, you could be in a situation where a team is playing a 3rd time. That's just going to be part of the system. And with 2 conferences, especially eating up a certain amount of 12 spots, let's say 7 or 8, like, it's kind of impossible to truly avoid it.
It is, and certainly we even saw that in the 14 playoff a couple of times, and even in the BCS, we saw that at least once, to the chagrin of many. It's interesting to also look at. I wanted to take a second, so just for the sake of curiosity, I wanted to use our current survivor pool and just really quickly run it through. Not only the way they would match up, but where they would match up. To me, is fascinating. So again, we have, just to remind you, we last episode eliminated Ohio State, so no, don't be surprised. It's Oregon.
They'll probably be in.
I know. But I'm going with, and also in the order the AP has them in, with our own order. So Oregon, Georgia, Penn State, Miami, Texas, Tennessee, BYU, Texas A&M, Clemson, Iowa State, Indiana, and Boise State. So the way this would work out, the conference champs in the top 4 would be Oregon, which would go to the Rose quarterfinal. Because again, that's the Big Ten, not the Pac-12, the Big Ten tie-in. Georgia as the SEC champ. We're assuming the top ones will be SEC, their conference champs, would go to the Sugar. Miami would go to the Peach, because that's the closest to Miami. Then BYU would be included, because they would obviously bump up to be the 4th seed. And then they would play in the Fiesta, which actually, again, not that bad of a placement for, if you're, especially with the connections historically. with some of those teams. I mean, the Fiesta Bowl was actually created to help those teams that were originally Arizona State was part of it, but when they were in their own conference together. Now, the rest would be seeded as such. You'd have, the number 5 would be Penn State, followed by Texas, Tennessee, Texas A&M, Clemson, Iowa State, Indiana, and Boise State. It would be absolutely fascinating to see how that would work, because then if Oregon wins, they would end up in the Cotton. If BYU wins, they would end up in the Cotton. At least in the way this would be structured. Again, if they were the highest seed to win. Now, let's be clear. BYU is the 4 seed. We're going to assume the 1, 2, and 3 will at least one of them will also win. But who knows? Maybe we'll get a year of chaos, which would be absolutely fantastic. But it'll be interesting to see. So Georgia would obviously be closer though to the orange. Miami would be a home game. So it would be fascinating to see how all of that could work out. I mean, it's interesting to kind of map that out and imagine how these could be. And then, of course, Penn State would host Boise State, which would be fantastic. I never even conceived of that kind of a game. That could actually be really interesting. Texas would host Indiana, Tennessee, Iowa State, and Texas A&M versus Clemson is going to be a heck of that. I mean, these are games I'm getting hyped up, even though these are probably not going to be what they're going to be.
Well, and let me move on to one other quick topic, and I want to kind of get into the idea of how the conference championship sort of thing works. So I want people to first understand it is the top 4 champions that get buys. It is not the 4 power conference champions. Those are not necessarily the same thing. Now, right now, they are. Most seasons, they would have been in the past and probably will be in the future. And the other thing, too, is that the 4 conference champions from power conferences are not guaranteed to make the field. As Bobak might remember from watching 2020 USC, in that particular season, and it was an outlier, but in that particular season, there were 2 Group of 5 champions, the AAC Cincinnati and the Sun Belt's Coastal Carolina, that ranked ahead of the Pac-12 champion USC. Now, some of this weirdness was it Oregon it was Washington that had a COVID situation, right? And so they couldn't play in the conference championship game. That's probably not going to happen. It's probably not going to happen again. But if that did happen, first of all, so let's say, for example, we have a really good Group of 5 team this year, and that's Boise State. So Boise State could absolutely finish higher than 10 or 9. And let's say, for example, that SMU, for whatever reason, wins the ACC or something like that. Well, Boise State could finish ahead of SMU and get a top 4 bye as a Group of 5 champion, which would mean that SMU would not get a bye. Now, the other piece that I want people to understand is that it's being framed a little like the 5th champion is guaranteed the 12 seed specifically. And that's not the case. The 5th champion is just guaranteed a spot in the college football playoff. Their seeding will be based on the rankings like anything else. So let's say, for example, that all 5 champions that make the field are in the top 9. That would mean that 10, 11, 12 would just be open for at-large teams. And the 5th conference champion would, let's say, be the 9th seed. And like you said, I think there's a pretty decent chance that if things keep going on this pathway, that we're in a situation where Boise State, as a 5th conference champion potentially, and maybe not even, maybe they'll be in the top 4, that they will not be the 12th seed, that they'll be rated higher than that in the rankings. Well, that means, again, that they would just be at that spot in the rankings. The only thing that's guaranteed is that they will get in as the 5th team.
Yeah, it's really, during the call, there was someone who just threw out a scenario and asked, because again, with the final CFP ranking last season, looking at where the current conference champ would be, it would have been, again, Michigan at number 1, Texas at number 3, Florida State at number 5, and then Arizona down at 14 and Liberty way down at 23. Somebody asked a scenario, well, what if Liberty's number 7? Would that mean that they would be just seeded number 7? And then I give, again, credit to Brent Daniels. He's like, well, okay, Brent Daniels, he's like, all right, wait 1 second. If that happens and Arizona stays where it is, Liberty would actually be the 4th seed, and then Arizona would be the 12th seed, because they would they would be below the 12 spots. It would have to be shoved up. So again, I like that. I give him credit for clarifying that, because that is exactly what could happen. And it's fascinating to see how this is. One thing I did want to mention, though, and this is something that I briefly met. And again, I'm going to just say he doesn't like to be called this, and you're going to tell us about this. But General Richard Clark, when I heard wow, that's going to be the next executive director, wow, it's going to be serious. It's going to be, a military man, former head of the Air Force Academy. And I remember I saw him on the sideline in the championship game in Houston. I just went to give myself a quick introduction. He seemed nice, but my goodness, hearing him in this is my first time really hearing him talk, because he gave the whole presentation. He is one of the most approachable people I've ever seen in a position like that. I was genuinely blown away. And you've had a chance to talk to him a lot.
Yeah. Again, I met him certainly at the mock selection that I did back in September. I spoke to him at some of the meetings that happened earlier this year. So I've probably gotten to speak to him actually probably 5 or 6 times. Because it's just everything profile wise, right? You expect to be intimidated. You expect him to be a no nonsense, stare you down kind of guy, looking through your soul, that sort of thing. And then, then you start talking to him and he's like, yeah, my son, he just finished up college. He's trying to figure out what he wants to do. And I'm like, oh, where'd he go to college? Oh, Harvard. He wants to be a commissioned officer. I'm like, all right, man. Okay. Just come on, man. But no, I mean, and I want to be clear, he and his family are that impressive. But like you said, he's very approachable. He very specifically does not want to be called General Clark. He wants to be called Rich. He wants to be referred to by his name, because he was like, I did my time in the military. There's a reason I retired. I'm ready to be a civilian again. That was one of the biggest attractions for him of taking this job, is he gets to be a civilian. He doesn't have to be all buttoned up all the time. And I think that when you get to see him talking and see his personality, it makes a lot of sense. I know that I've been asked a little bit, what is the executive director position of the college football playoff? And I actually think that this is a fascinating question, and one that I think actually was probably kind of debated in the room, frankly, whenever they were deciding who to hire next. So the previous executive director was a guy named Bill Hancock. He came from a very athletic administration background. He came from a communications background. Actually, it was funny for me. I only got to know him when I started covering the playoff, when he was in his 70s. But a lot of people who cover the sport nationally have known him for 30 plus years, because he was involved with the BCS. He was one of the directors of the BCS. He's been a director of the Final Four. So he has a very deep athletic administration background. Well, General Rich Clark, I'm still trying to get used to it. But Rich comes from, again, a military background, but he was the superintendent, I want to say, of the Air Force Academy. Mm-hmm. And so he has a background of administrating college sports during his time there. He was very involved in the Mountain West Athletic Conference, all this sort of stuff. But I think that what they wanted when making a hire was very much to come in and say, we need somebody who is versatile enough to be able to adjust to different roles. One thing that's been talked about is, hey, the college football playoff could play a role in administrating college athletics long term, above and separate from the NCAA. They wanted somebody who was capable of that. I think they wanted somebody who had a background in government, just in case that sort of thing came up. I think that they wanted somebody who obviously knows about academics and just that side of things as well, but also has sort of big picture administrative experience. And so this job, so much of it, there's so much focus on the playoff, right? There's so much focus on the actual selection and the games. That's what everybody focuses on. But what makes this a 365-day-a-year job is actually logistics. The hardest thing about the college football playoff is not whether to put Alabama or Florida State in the playoff. It's having to deal with hundreds of people and trying to get them all on the same page. Whether that's just straight up rules about rules about how should the playoff work, and again, even that stuff is probably stuff that people like to talk about. But there's what dates should we do? What times should the games be at? Who's going to organize this stuff? What exactly is the college football playoff organization going to do? So that's the job of this person, is so much to literally administer the college football playoff all year round. And again, like, so his day to day can look very different. Sometimes it's going to be, hey, you know what, the playoff game is in Atlanta, and we need to be on the phone with Atlanta city government to make sure that they're prepared for the logistics of putting this game on. It could also be, hey, does this place have enough hotel rooms to deal with all this? How many hotel rooms, by the way, should be allocated to, so it's very logistical whenever you actually get into the details of this role. And frankly, like, that's not a super exciting answer. But that's what makes it such an important role, is that you're having to deal with an organization that has so many of its hands in so many different places. And being sort of the guy who facilitates all of that is a job that not many people can do.
It is interesting to kind of compare both of their careers just very lightly. I don't want to get too into the weeds on this because, again, Bill Hancock, really nice guy. And we talked about that offline before, but he's been basically at this point, by the time he took the CFP and was the inaugural executive director, he is a career sports executive in many ways. I mean, his background was sports journalism. And then he became, like some folks, rather than going to the journalism aspect of it, he went right into sports information. And from there kind of rose up into conferences and was, worked their way up the ladder there to become, as you said, director of the Final Four for the NCAA for many years, over a decade, as I recall. And then, of course, helped create the BCS and then helped create its successor, the College Football Playoff. And by the time I remember when I met him, I'm like, this is a guy who's been doing this for a long time. That's all I thought. I'm like, this is a guy who is a comfortable college exec who has been doing, and I mean, not to say that, I don't mean that in a pejorative, but just like there's a certain attitude.
Yeah.
And Rich has been refreshing because first of all, military guy. He flew bombers. He actually played football for Air Force. Let me just be clear. Yep. He actually was a defensive lineman. Can fly bombers. Obviously, career military. That's a different mentality altogether. It's very no nonsense. It's logistically oriented. And so that part at least made sense to me because I'm like, okay, you need someone who can handle logistics. You get, again, someone who was the head of the Air Force Academy. I believe that, especially someone who played football, even better. But yeah, again, I disarmingly accessible person. So again, if you all hear him or run into him, he's the type of person who went up to him and said like, hey, he'd probably smile and go like, hey, not that Bill Hancock wouldn't, but it would be a different approach. It would be much more approachable than you'd expect for someone with that level of background.
Yes.
Well, I think we'll take a quick break. When we come back, we'll take a look at some of the big games coming up here in Week 10 on the College Football Survivor Show.
The College Football Survivor Show, where playoff survival is always on the line.
All right, so Week 10's coming up. It was funny when I was kind of looking at these games. There's a couple of important ones, and then you could kind of pick from others a little bit more selective. And I like that because that means there's going to be some game we're not looking at. That's probably going to be the one to come and be the one we really start talking about next week. But there is one game at the very top that let's just get it off the bat. I'm, of course, talking about Penn State, number 3, versus Ohio State, number 4. This is Ohio State's second time playing the top 3 team in the nation. This is one of the first time in ages they're ranked below Penn State. It's rare. It has happened in the last decade, but it's rare. What are your thoughts on this game?
This one is really interesting. And the reason that I say that is I think that the sort of narrative going into this game is like, is Penn State this level? They're currently number 3 in the country. They're largely number 3 in the country because they haven't had to play much of anybody to this point. But are they actually this level? And I think that there's a lot of sort of, I think that the big prevailing question heading into this game is, how will Penn State's passing offense be able to move the ball? Especially, will they be able to do it with consistency against Ohio State? Because I think that we have this like sort of baseline of what Penn State's going to be defensively. I think that we feel like, okay, they'll be able to run the ball a little bit, But are they able to spread the field? Are they able to be dynamic? Are they able to cause problems for Ohio State? When I look at Ohio State, I mean, this has been a team that has been really good at stuffing the run and has been a little susceptible whenever teams drop back to pass. And, I know that I've seen a lot of complaints from Ohio State fans about a pass rush that hasn't been as elite as they expected with Jack Sawyer and JT Tuimoloau coming back. And so a big asterisk on that question is the fact that that Drew Aller is questionable heading into the weekend. And Bo Prabula would be the guy if Aller can't go. Now, the thing that's interesting about that is that Prabula gives them a lot more as a dual threat player. He gives them a running aspect that Aller just really doesn't. And when you look at Andy Kotelnicki's history, I mean, like, he has a lot of
coordinator
experience.
for those who may not remember, and offensive coordinator at Penn State.
Yes, and he came from Kansas, where they obviously run a lot of misdirection. They run a lot of wide zone. They move their quarterbacks a lot. They also, by the way, had a lot of success with a backup quarterback last year in Jason Bean. So, I mean, like, I don't think there's a wrong answer here if you're Andy Kotelnicki. The other side, though, is like, we got to see some down-to-down consistency from Ohio State running the ball. I was reading a great piece from Alex Kirshner over at Opta Analyst, and what he figured out is that there's a stat in third or fourth down situations of 2 yards or less. Ohio State is a bottom 10 team in the country at converting those opportunities in the power conferences.
Yeah.
That's not good. They're converting on 65% of those runs with Quinshawn Judkins and Travion Henderson in the backfield. Like that, and by the way, Will Howard too, as a runner. Like that sucks. That's really bad.
How much of this can we blame on the injury to Josh Simmons, or is that just part of
this
the
is
bigger
a season-long
problem?
stat, though. This is a season-long stat, and I think that it's if this was a question specifically about the Nebraska game, I mean that I think had a lot to do with Josh Simmons. If you're looking at a season-long stat, and by the way, the other piece of this too, so they're probably their best lineman is Donovan Jackson at left guard. I would have thought that he and Seth McLaughlin probably would have been able to do all right. Like that they would have been okay just running behind him in those 2-yard opportunities. Apparently it just hasn't worked. Maybe they're trying too hard to get him there. Maybe I don't know what it is, but like it's just not happening. And you are going to be in a lot of positions where you're going to need to convert 4th and 2, 4th and 3, 3rd and 2, 3rd and 3, 3rd and 4 against this Penn State defense, which is obviously very aggressive. And while I do think that like Ohio State is good enough, especially at receiver, that maybe they can just pass their way out of it. I mean, you don't want to become predictable against Abdul Carter. Like you just don't want to become predictable against a guy like that. So, I mean, like, I don't know. Ohio State is still my my title pick, of course. They're still, to me, the best team in the Big Ten. But this is the week where that can change in so many ways. And I feel a lot less good about Ohio State after last week than I did heading in.
Yeah, it's interesting because you mentioned that obviously Abdul Carter and Danny Dennis Sutton are going to be, a big part of that pass rush for Penn State. And from what we've seen, Will Howard struggles a little bit under pressure. He doesn't have as high of a rating when he's put in those situations. And certainly that's something that the Penn State defense is going to take advantage of. Flipping back to that Penn State offense, one thing, since we are a little bit past midseason, and it was a big question going into this season, do you think that James Franklin has given Alex Kotelnicki enough opportunity to be creative to make Penn State relevant? Because that was the big question too. We've seen him hire coordinators, and then it almost feels like handcuff them a little bit because he has his own view of how it should work. Do you think he's given Kotelnicki a little enough rope to kind of do what he needs to do?
So far, yes. I will say I do feel like there have been moments and times where it feels like, okay, here's like a little Kotelnicki stuff built on top of Franklin stuff. So this will be kind of the big prove it game where they have to come out with their best stuff. But I do think overall, I do feel like I mean, Franklin gave him $1.9 million per year for an offensive coordinator. Like that's pretty crazy stuff, right? I mean, even at a school like Penn State. And the other thing too is that I feel like when you look at their statistical profile and the success that they've been having passing the ball with Drew Aller to this point, like this is way more than anything that they had last year, right? Like this I think is a different system. They're asking Drew Aller to do different things than they did last year, and he's responding. I mean, his completion percentage is up from 59.9% to 71%. His yards per attempt is from 6.8 to 10. Like they're asking him to do way more stuff and they're making the game easier for him in the process. So I do think that they've done it. The question is, okay, now is like a big moment. Do they continue to do it?
Another major game, and one I think is arguably the other marquee game. Well, maybe not as marquee as number 3 versus number 4, but still ranked versus ranked game of interest is going to be in the ACC, and it's a game you're going to be covering. Number 18 Pittsburgh, the of the undefeated P4, certainly the least talked about, 7-0, 3-0 in the ACC, heading to SMU, number 20, 7-1, undefeated in the ACC, although they certainly seem to want to give opportunities last week against Duke. What do we make of this game? I mean, you have, Pat Narduzzi's defense, you have SMU, can they? I mean, I have to just say, the defense of Pitt stole everybody's attention when you pick off Kyle McCord 5 times with 3 pick sixes. That was still, I watched that game and it was like watching just an amazing train. You couldn't tell, is this a train wreck on one side or is the other side also really good? There was a bit of both. That wonderful interception where the guy was lying prone and the ball fell in his hands. I mean, you couldn't even ask for that. That art but sports guy absolutely nailed it in that one too. I have to say, I love that guy. I've talked to him before. Before he became big, I'm like, I have to ask, are you using AI? And he's like, no, I'm not. It ends up he actually comes out here to the Twin Cities sometimes to work. So I was just kind of like, I don't even know if he needs to work anymore. Like this is anyway. I'll set that aside. But what do you make of this game? I mean, you're going to be covering it.
Yeah, this one's going to be a really interesting game. 2 teams that are undefeated in ACC play, a team that's still undefeated overall. I think that, by the way, if Pitt beats SMU, like Pitt's got to move into the top 10, I would say at that point,
Yeah.
right? Like after a win like that, I mean, because SMU is what, number 21 or something like that?
They're 20
think.
now.
So they're 20 now. Yeah. So like you're talking about a top 20 team going on the road, beating them. Like you have to start getting into that top 10 conversation. I'd imagine too that we're going to see, 1 or 2 teams kind of in that top 10 range fall too, that they should hopefully jump in front of. For SMU, like this is also, I think, a huge prove-it game. If they win this game, then they are most likely playing in the ACC title game. Now, there's also something to be said for some hilarious tiebreaker scenarios that we could find ourselves in. That's kind of been a hot conversation on social media right now. So, like, we could be looking at a scenario, because they don't all play each other, where SMU, Clemson, and Miami all end up undefeated in ACC play. And I think that I saw that right now, if things kind of ended the way that they were right now, it would be Miami, undefeated, that would get left out of the ACC title game, because it would be based solely on the combined record of your opponents in ACC play only. Because Clemson
Makes
played
sense.
Georgia and lost, SMU played BYU and lost, but neither of those were ACC losses. Well,
Nope.
In a funny way, Clemson and SMU would benefit from the fact that they play Pitt, and Miami doesn't play Pitt. So that would pull up their winning percentage quite a bit in terms of opposing. So, it's going to be, I think, a huge game. When I look at this one piece of news to mention is that Pitt quarterback Eli Holstein is apparently questionable for this game. And that would be a huge loss. Nate Yarnell is the backup. It would be a homecoming for him. He's one of those Lake Travis quarterbacks from Austin. Like Baker Mayfield went there, Charlie Brewer went there. Like they've had all sorts of these guys come through. But I think that Hudson Card. But I think that obviously they'd love to have Eli Holstein healthy and in the starting lineup for such a big game. If Holstein doesn't play, I mean, I think you have to lean SMU. SMU, like this past week, they became only the second team since 2000 to win a game after losing the turnover battle 6-0. The
Yeah.
last one was in 2011. But I think that it was a little bit of a look ahead spot playing Duke on the road. I think that they know how big this game is going to be. So I expect them to come with their best stuff available. I think I lean SMU in this game. I think that they're just a little more dynamic offensively. They're really good defensively. And I mean, again, like you got like a positive luck type of game last week if you're Pittsburgh, and you got a crazy negative luck game if you're SMU last week. I feel like those things kind of meet in the middle this week.
I'm just going to note, we're not going to necessarily go into too much detail. Duke was interesting, at least last week, because they still only had one ACC loss, one loss overall. They're heading over to play Miami this weekend. And then, which actually would maybe Miami's toughest game of the rest of the season based on how things might look. And then Clemson, it's interesting. They're playing Louisville. Louisville may be their toughest opponent since Georgia. It'll be curious to see how Clemson looks there, although not to say that Louisville has been a bit of a disappointment this season. But this is where it gets interesting, though. Beyond those two games that we previously mentioned, there aren't as many obvious candidates. And I was kind of glancing around. I was trying to almost look at it like a college football playoff bracket. Like, all right, let me pick at least one marquee game from each conference. Big 12 was kind of interesting. I think I settled on, and I'd love to know your thoughts on this, is Texas Tech at Iowa State the most interesting game in the Big 12 this week, because there aren't too many. I mean, Texas Tech 5-3, they've had kind of a bad streak. They're now 3-2 in conference. They seem to be promising early on, and then Iowa State is trying to keep up this historic start. They had a bye week, but they're, as we've heard, 7-0, first time since 1938. If they pull this off, it'll be the first time they've ever been opening 8-0, which is remarkable, but also a statement about the state of Iowa State football, particularly in those Big 8 years. But what do you make of that? Is that the one that you think would be most compelling in the Big 12?
I don't know if there's another one that can really contend with it, to be honest, unless you love some sicko stuff. And then like Baylor TCU is going to be a crazy anxiety bowl, but I don't know if it'll.
It looks like, I mean, hey, 64.5 over under with a 3-point spread. Yeah. It sounds like it's just going to be fun.
Yeah. I was texting with some TCU friends yesterday, and I'm like, I feel like I see if Baylor wins the game, I think they'll be happy. Like, I think their fans will be happy. If TCU wins the game, I think that their fans will be happy, but also like could feel a little sick afterwards, depending on how it goes. And whoever loses this game is going to feel absolutely horrendous. Like, just absolutely like, how do we lose to those guys? This sucks. And the other thing too is that I don't think that either team winning is going to make either fan base feel like we figured something out. Like, I think that it's going to be more like, "Whew, our opponent sucks." I don't think that. Anyway. But so that's going to be a very interesting game. I guess I'm going to have to watch that one from the press box at SMU, because I'm going to be in that stadium when that one's going on. But
for Iowa State versus Texas Tech, I mean, obviously we know what Iowa State's strengths are. They have some great receivers. Texas Tech hasn't been necessarily great at covering receivers. And of course, Texas Tech has Todd Brooks on the ground. How do you see these teams stacking up?
Yeah, I think it's a good test for Iowa State. My big thing is I just feel like Iowa State is going to be able to air the ball out against this Texas Tech defense. They've struggled to be on the same page at times. Their pass rush has struggled to get home a lot of the time, and I've talked about it all year long, but Iowa State has two receivers, in Jaden Higgins and Jalen Noel, who I think can flip the game on its head in so many ways. I also think that this is a Texas Tech rush defense that down to down is pretty good, but gives up a lot of big plays. And if there's a guy who you don't want to give up big plays against, it's Abu Sama at running back. He is somebody who can change a game in an instant. So yeah. I kind of think that this is one of those that whenever we look at the end, we're like, oh, the stats were pretty close. The success rate was pretty close. And Iowa State just had 4 plays that just completely changed the game. And it ends up being a 17-point win.
It's a remarkably dry week for the SEC. I mean, unless we're counting UMass at Mississippi State, which of course could be the upset of the century. No, but the question I do have, though, I was looking at Texas A&M at South Carolina. Again, it's thin pickings. There's like Kentucky at Tennessee, Ole Miss at Arkansas. Well, that could turn wacky. The Hogs are very unpredictable. But I ended up looking at this because A&M obviously riding high after that LSU game. South Carolina has been tougher than their record might indicate. They certainly can be. But also it'll be interesting to see how good, Texas A&M's defensive line does on that offensive line of South Carolina. What do you make of that? Is that the SEC game to look for in your mind, or
Yeah, I mean it's definitely up there with the SC games to watch. I've got like half an eye on Florida, Georgia. I think Florida's starting to figure some things out. I think that Arkansas Ole Miss could be a really good game, but I kind of think that Ole Miss is just not very good. So it, I don't know if you can call it a marquee game just because of that. I think that the thing that's interesting about Texas A&M versus South Carolina is I expect the quarterback to be Marcel Reed, who was thrust in the second half of their last game against LSU. And it's a different thing to game plan for a running quarterback than it is to have one thrust on you at halftime.
Mhm.
So that's going to be the biggest thing to me. I think that South Carolina will not have anywhere near enough offense to make this a real game. But I think that the way that Texas A&M plays against a pretty good South Carolina defense, especially on the defensive line, will be telling. How does Marcel Reed handle the pressure? And the other piece that I want to see more of is how does Marcel Reed handle drop back passing situations? Because coming into last week, he was completing only 54% of his passes. He completed the 2 that he threw against LSU, but he's going to have to throw a few more than 2 passes to beat South Carolina on the road at Williams-Brice. So I do think that Texas A&M ultimately comes away with a victory, but we're going to learn a lot about these teams.
I do. I'm just going to acknowledge the game, although we're not going to really break it down. I'm very curious to see if Vandy bounces back with a game at Auburn. And I do just want to acknowledge Hugh Freeze's great quote where he's like, I'm tired of playing Diego Pavia. The guy has got his numbers. So that actually, there's a little bit of fun side story to that just because Freeze is just probably like, not you again. And you seem to only be getting better.
Well, this is nuts. Auburn is favored by 7 points against Vanderbilt and Diego Pavia. That is ridiculous. Go win some money. Actually, don't do that. I am not giving betting advice in college football, but like that feels crazy to me. First of all, like how many teams all season has Auburn beaten by 7 points? Like it's not that many. Let me run through their schedule real quick. Hold up a second. I'm getting to their schedule page. Okay. They beat Cal. No, they lost to Cal. I can't even read a schedule right now. They have beaten one power conference team this year by 7 points, and it was Kentucky, who might be the worst team in the SEC right now, though Mississippi State is trying to give them a run for their money. Otherwise, their power conference games are lose by 7 to Cal, lose by 10 to Arkansas, lose by 6 to a terrible Oklahoma team, lose by 18 to Georgia, lose by 4 to Missouri. I don't see the vision here. I don't understand how. I'm not saying that Auburn won't win.
Yeah, Vanderbilt feels closest to those teams than Alabama, A&M, and New Mexico.
I just don't get it. I'm not saying that like Auburn can win this game, absolutely, but like a 7-point favorite, come on
now. Yeah, I just wanted to also again kind of looking at all around college football, the number one arguably G5 game of relevance this week. Army's, by the way, on a bye week, so they're not even in the conversation this week. San Diego State, overall record stinks. They're 3-4, but they're 2-0 in the Mountain West, and they are heading to Boise State on Friday to play the Broncos. Crazy things happen in the Mountain West. Even I still remember that wild Hawaii season in 07, watching that. And every week Hawaii would just be in this wild firefight and eventually win. So I'm not saying that's going to be every week for Boise State. They had a really big win last Friday against UNLV. Is there any risk of a letdown here? And San Diego State, after a kind of a pretty bad start, seems to be finding its way under first-year head coach Sean Lewis.
Yeah, like you said, I mean, they're improving week over week. Like this past week, they take Washington State to the limit. We think that Washington State is a pretty good team. They are going on the road, and I think that Boise State at home is a lot. I also just don't love having for San Diego State to match up rush defense wise against Ashton Genty. Like, it feels like a game that maybe, well, okay, let me say this. I think that the measure of this game is how much does Boise State have to play Ashton Genty? Because the answer should be not much. But I think this could turn into a Hawaii type game where, like, you're just sitting there and like having to continue bashing it until they finally break through and pull away. And that was the 28-7 game. From a success rate perspective, San Diego State is actually pretty good at defending the pass, but they're not good against the run. And it turns out that that's Boise State's pretty good at running the ball. So I would say that that's not an ideal situation heading in.
Absolutely. Well, again, it was a thin selection for us here to pick from the G5s. This has been quite weak, and many of them have been eliminated. I mean, right now it really is just a kind of a two-horse race between Boise State and Army until some other twist and turn hits all of this. Well, it's going to be an exciting week of college football no matter what. I mean, I still love the fact that last week, that Liberty Kennesaw State is still one of, I was actually looking at what the most successful posts every week to week are on the Reddit section of college football section of Reddit. And the number one post last week was actually the post-game discussion for Kennesaw State's upset of Liberty. So, it's little games like that make you realize, like, every week is fun. Every game is fun. I love this sport. We know you do too. We'll go ahead and wrap this one up. On behalf of all of us, thank you for listening. All of you out there, want to thank our producer, Joey Aliberti. Be sure to like, rate, and subscribe to us wherever you get your podcasts. Find us on X and TikTok at CFP Survivor Show. He's Shehan Jayaraja. You can find his work on CBSSports.com and at Shehan Jayaraja on X and TikTok. I'm Bobak Kyrie, part of the group that runs Reddit CFP. Thanks for listening.
The College Football Survivor Show, where playoff survival is always on the line.